Tim, I think it was late last year, perhaps earlier this year. You guys bought a small business in Chattanooga.
We did.
Called Texla by the one and only Ryan Rogers. Now, I understand the reason was you wanted to be here in Freight Alley and have a presence here.
That was 100% of the reason. The entire
Nothing to do with
investment.
Technology
No.
or the founder. But you guys did, in all seriousness, you did buy Texla. What was the impetus for that? I mean, it was certainly one of the, Ryan, as I believe, didn't raise any outside money. So as a founder, it was the perfect outcome because you build a business, you sell it to an entity that can essentially take that platform and build onto it. Tell us really what drove that.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, we love the team, right? We're really people first. And so Ryan is a huge quality human being and has built a great team around him, right? And so that's table stakes. Anything you want to do with a business, right? It's all people. Right. So that was first and foremost. And the second was we loved the way it put drivers at the center of the product. And anything that connects drivers, brokers, drivers, carriers, we got really excited about. And as we learned more about the business, what we learned was that there was this really interesting permeability between drivers that were already in our system and kind of flowing back and forth into the Texla world. And so we really looked at it as a market expansion for us as a way to create something of more value for both sides of the equation.
So it struck me when I was talking to Ryan back at our AI summit that we had, our Freight Pride Summit, in Dallas. It was interesting because I think it was right after that transaction. And it struck me that you guys have all this data on the U.S. truck driver and what's going on. And I'd love to sort of learn a lot of talks about the current state of the truck driver, good and bad, if you will. But it also, ultimately, the capacity constraints in this industry, I mean, this is the longest freight recession in history. The capacity constraints is the truck driver. And you have a firsthand perspective on what does that look like. I'd love to get your take on what you're seeing in the truck driving population. What are the drivers concerned about? What are they thinking about? And then how are carriers thinking about responding to these issues?
Absolutely. We're fortunate enough that we work with, and we see application job seeking behavior across millions of drivers. And what we've seen really since the beginning of 24 is really unprecedented. Traditionally what we would see as the freight market would get weaker, we would see faster turnover. Drivers more quick to go out on the market and see, even if they didn't switch jobs, they were quick to go apply. And starting in 24, what we saw is the drivers were like, look, the grass isn't greener on the other side of the fence, and really sitting out longer. Not indefinitely, but sitting out longer. And you can absolutely see that in the data across the platform. And we do, to mention a little bit, we probably do 8 to 10 million sort of full DOT compliant apps and some multiple of that of sort of lead form apps. So we feel pretty good about our ability to see and extrapolate across the market writ large. And what we've seen in the last 60 days or so, is it a blip? Is it a trend? We'll see. Is we've seen that those drivers start to be a little bit more aggressive about when they're looking and where they're looking.
They're more demanding. Is the message based on this 2 months of data that the drivers feel like they have a little bit more a leverage in the market than perhaps before?
I don't know if it's leverage as much as there's maybe a skosh more optimism about the grass might in fact be greener on the other side of the fence.
It's a have and have-nots issue.
Yeah.
There are, in every down market, at least historically, except for this one, which I think it has its own. We'll talk about that in a second. Every down market historically, when freight dries up, the drivers go to the higher quality motor carriers, particularly the ones that operate in the contract market, to stay loaded because those are the guys that have freight. They can keep them running. What you're saying is that isn't how the market's been operating up until recently. Is that
no? They're going to the bigger carriers. They're just staying longer.
They're not leaving when the market.
They're not leaving as much as they normally do. And in fact, like when we look at it by segment, so we work with a lot of private fleets as well. If you look on a same-store sales basis, 25 over 24, application volume for most of our for-hire fleets is down year over year. And there's some advertising spend cutbacks, right, driving that. Our private fleet clients are up 15, 20 points year over year, same store sales
Wow.
basis, right? Or drivers are clearly sort of voting with their feet in a movement to safety.
They're moving to private fleets because they're not exposed to the cycle. Is that what you're
Exactly.
saying?
It's viewed as a safer
It's the for
bet.
hire market that becomes problematic or challenging.
Exactly. And you see that on the for hire side, the bigger the fleet, the safer it's perceived by drivers.
Well, it
Right?
makes sense. I mean,
It absolutely.
there is a flight to quality element in this, and
Exactly.
it's interesting because back to Pat, one of the questions, and I'd love to get your take on this is how is this freight recession actually like? How do we get here? Is the question that I think so many executives have been asking themselves, and there's been a ton of we've written a ton about it. We talked a lot about it. Is this freight recession is not operating under the normal physics of a freight recession.
Exactly.
And it's usually what happens is a couple things. Freight collapses or drops, so however you want to describe it. Certainly in recent days or recent months, it feels like it's collapsed. The market corrects because you get rid of the sort of weaker actors. And my father was here this morning, and there was moments when U.S. Express was in weakness based on where they were in their capital situation. And he talked about there was some near-death experiences of a billion-dollar trucking company. Ryan Rogers knows this painfully because he told me afterwards, he's like, yeah, I was the one who had to go deal with the banks. As Max was saying, these near-death experiences, he knows it well. So it doesn't matter the size, but oftentimes it does. These guys have more flexibility. But this, normally freight stays with the larger carriers. It doesn't. This freight recession just hasn't operated that way. We've had these operators that have just lasted so much longer. And I assume we've had growth of new entrants into the market in ways that is unprecedented from a soft market. Is that?
I think so. And I think, smarter people than me with more data have, thrown up their hands trying to figure out exactly what's going on. I think you're seeing a lot of small carriers with no real viable alternatives and just stay in even though
They just refuse to park the truck.
they've just got no other options,
Yeah.
right? And I think you've got, if you look over the last 3 or 4 years, our private fleet business has really, really grown,
Yeah.
right? And part of that is, they're picking up more and more of those miles, right?
Well, it makes sense. I mean, if I'm a high quality driver, and I know that I can get hired on at Walmart or a large private fleet, and you can name it doesn't matter which one we're naming. My job is more secure because they don't have to operate the physics of trucking.
Exactly.
If I go work at a Night Swift or U.S. Express or Jim Bob Trucking, I am going to have to operate the physics and the economics of trucking.
Right.
I'm only going to make as much money as available in the trucking market. Whereas I've worked for PepsiCo, I'm still delivering Pepsi. People are still delivering Pepsi in any economy, and it's a much safer job. I want to talk a little bit about. There's been a lot of conversation. We've talked about it a lot. Certainly, the administration's focused on it. Is everything from the ELP mandate, which is the English proficiency requirement, that was actually on the statutes and on the books that sort of got ignored.
Right. Right.
That's the first one. And then the non-domiciled CDLs is sort of the second big thing. I'd love to understand from your perspective, how are fleets responding to the new regulatory oversight that is being asked of them by the DOT?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, fleets are in such a tough position, right? And in many senses, a no-win position. Look, the fact that somebody has a CDL means less and less in terms of the fleet exposure to nuclear verdicts, and and it's like, look, what can you count on? It feels like fleets are being asked to do the government's job, right? Is this guy safe to operate a vehicle? Right. And so I think is the first thing that comes to mind. I think what we're hearing from clients is a lot of concern around, hey, how do we get ahead of the ELP stuff? From an abundance of caution. And then, quite frankly, we don't hear a lot from our clients about the non-dom drivers. I think those tended to be, not exclusively, but tended to be concentrated more on the very, very small, the people who are the most questionable carriers to begin with.
Yeah, a lot of them are, I posted this on X, and immediately the word immigration brings in all sorts of opinions. It's a very polarizing term. And, got accused of being racist in that topic because the word immigration, but it's actually a lot of Eastern Europeans. Like these are white dudes from Eastern Europe.
Right.
Which are the notorious, in many cases, notorious actors themselves. And they come over here, oftentimes have connections, many of them have connections to organized crime. Those businesses are based overseas, and they have a whole system of bringing in drivers. They either come over here on tourist visas, or they come over and they don't respect U.S., certainly many U.S. laws, but certainly hours of service doesn't matter. They'll run 20 hours a day.
Right.
And the problem is the lack of enforcement has really driven down the ability for motor carriers to actually be able to self-correct. And it strikes me that that is the most pervasive issue that our industry faces, is that you have a lot of differing quality that the government has enabled and perhaps empowered for these operators to be in a business.
Oh, exactly. And I think the big question is, hey, are the number of drivers in that, if you just sort of aggregate, for the sake of discussion, ELP and non-dom drivers into one bucket, and you say, okay, is that going to take 20,000 drivers out of the market? Is it going to take 200,000 drivers or 500,000 drivers? And I don't think anybody really knows. I had a conversation, and I've forgotten her name, somebody from the ATA Council's office at an event a couple weeks ago, and she thought the number was closer to 200,000.
Yeah, well, the FMCSA published the 200,000.
Oh, okay.
And I believe it was Overdrive, one of our competitors, had done the FOIA request. By the way, a year ago, I was getting hammered on X about this issue, and I kind of blew it off. My first inclination, look, I tend historically been very pro-immigration and very empathetic to people who grow up in these countries of just horrible conditions. And I first blew it off as more of a xenophobic thing, and it sort of made my own judgment. And it was only after, I believe Overdrive did this FOIA request where they started asking, because I didn't even believe it was possible that you could issue a driver's license to someone who didn't pass a CDL test. Like, where did that come from?
I know.
That it seems ludicrous that that would be even allowed, or didn't have a work permit. And I just didn't believe that that was even possible. We now know it is, and it's been proven out by DOT, FMCSA. Overdrive deserves a lot of credit for their FOIA request. And I think that was 200,000, if I'm not mistaken, in something like 8 states. Like, it was California, Illinois was pretty pervasive, but there's a lot of states actually that I don't think hit the list. They didn't even bother getting the numbers because the records were such a mess.
Right.
And so the question is, how big is that number? I don't know that we know.
I know.
What is in terms of what you guys are doing as a business, you bought Texla, okay. You've acquired a couple other businesses recently. We've been talking a lot over the last couple of days about these platform businesses. Tenstreet's a platform, and you have the best resource and platform for driver information of any company out there. Where do you take it from here?
I think we get excited, and one of the challenges we have as a business is we think there's so many different places we have opportunity, right? We think we can leverage our community of drivers, our relationship with drivers, the data we have about drivers, in a way to meaningfully impact just sort of the freight fraud of, like, who's the driver showing up at the dock. I think we can help people answer that in a way that's unique. We're super excited about that. I think, the business started, on the recruiting applicant tracking side. We're much more into sort of full sort of life cycle management is kind of the term we're using today. And that part of the business has really grown well. And we think, obviously, the text locate business, we're super excited about. Hey, what can we do with those relationships in the brokerage world, in a way that's a new space for us that we get excited about. So it's, I'm a product guy, and I like building stuff. And I love having the problem of, hey, I like to tell people sometimes my job is to say no to good ideas, because hopefully we're saying yes to better ones. And we have a lot of good ideas on the table right now.
Oh, it's a resource thing.
It's always a resource thing. Software is infinitely easier to dream up than it is to build.
Yeah, it's funny because there's been 2 things. Platform businesses should be platform businesses, and they can partner and they can acquire. It's easier to be the platform than it is to perhaps build organically. That was one trend. The second is focus, and focusing on choosing what you do versus doing a lot of things. What does that mean for Tenstreet? Where do you go? Is it all about the driver? Is that the future of the business? You mentioned brokers somewhere in there.
I think anything where we get excited, where we think we can create real value, is we think interactions with drivers writ large, whether that's carrier to driver, broker to driver, recruiter to driver, safety person to driver, whatever. We think there's lots and lots of friction in those interactions. We think we can build software to remove a lot of that friction, right? That gets us really excited.
So ultimately, the truck driver, this hit me when we were talking freight fraud in Dallas, is like, and we talked this morning, there's my nefarious truck driver right there, Matt. Ultimately, is that if I'm a broker or I'm a shipper and I give a load, I'm actually giving it to a human driver. It may have a red truck, a blue truck, and an orange truck, but ultimately it's a human that's in that cab. And I can do all the work that is possible on that carrier, but if I don't know who the driver is, then I'm exposing myself. My counterparty is the problem, and my counterparty is ultimately the truck driver. Is that where this leads?
It is, and I think you're looking the other way. If I know who the driver is, I might be, in some sense, less concerned about necessarily the name on the truck.
Sorry?
You might be less concerned with the name on the truck, right?
It makes complete sense.
You might, and we think those are really interesting interactions. How that plays out in the real world, yeah.
I mean, ultimately, credentialing of drivers. I mean, the government tried to do the TWIC card and varying. I don't know if they ever, outside of some government stuff, they got a little bit of traction, I think, in some of the sort of high security stuff. And that was a September 11 sort of Patriot Act thing. But it ultimately feels like if I'm a broker or a shipper and I could ensure, I remember hauling freight. We were hauling auto parts for Pacer, and I remember getting this lecture from this guy who was running logistics, and he's like, I don't want any drivers that hadn't been in here less than 10 years. And I was at Express, and I'm like, sorry, we don't have a lot of those. I don't know that your freight's will get picked up. But it is interesting because the more seasoned veteran drivers, also the ones that have proven they can handle the freight, like in dispatch, we knew the drivers that you could depend on. Like there was a few, everyone had a board. These are the guys or the girls that I will call when I have a load that I absolutely need. Do not call that one.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that is the power that you guys have with all this data.
Yeah, exactly.
And identifying and credentialing. And I hope that you use that. I hope that we see in time that is something that does give and empower and make our industry safer, because I think it's ultimately what we're
doing. No, it's exactly what we're after. And how do we do it in a way that makes sense from the driver's perspective? Because done wrong, it's really big brothery and drivers opt out.
Yeah, for sure. Right? But it's also an issue, I think, for the motor carriers because they don't want to be disintermediated. And so how do you do it in a way that they are a part of the solution?
Oh, exactly.
Because for you guys, that's critical, right? You don't want to do anything that upsets them. But I think that is and like highways there's been some pushback, and I'm going to challenge Michael Caney here in a minute on it. There's been some pushback on highway because they serve the interest of the brokers. And I think they want to serve the interest of the carriers. But there's a question of, if I have filtered you out and have required you to do all this stuff, what am I actually doing with it? And those are always, anybody in trucking knows it's a problem. I mean, I remember we installed SATCOM dishes inside of trucks, which seems so like predated ELD devices, and drivers were convinced that we were listening to their conversations and stuff, which was ridiculous. We couldn't even manage dispatches, but don't you like listen to their conversations? But
yeah, that balance between the two, and then the sort of the maintenance of sort of credibility on both sides of the equation, super important, way easier said than done, but absolutely so critical.
So Tim, you've been in this business for a while. You've seen a lot of things. What is the roadmap for Tenstreet beyond that? Is there going to be more acquisitions? Are you guys looking at businesses? Do you like big deals? It seems like you guys really like features and products that can solve problems, and then want to deploy it into your platform. Is that?
That's been our primary inorganic strategy, right? Is trying to build out sort of the product portfolio, and that will continue. We have a great capital partner that's very aggressive at looking at deals, and Providence Equity is our primary.
They've been around this industry for some time.
They have, and great partners, and so we're looking at that. One of our mantras internally is, hey, we try to create value first, do something interesting, and I think we're more in pursuit of that than necessarily like an arbitrary deal about looking just scale for scale's sake or size for size sake, and making sure that whatever we do, makes sense and there's a degree of industrial logic in it.
That makes sense. Well, I can congratulate you. Welcome to town.
Thank you.
Belated,
Thank you.
but it's really credit to I think your team, the Texla team is right up front, right? So in their offices, you can't miss the banner that, by the way, Ryan is the cheapest, but there's a but there, because I know Ryan, I work with Ryan. He's the cheapest but most agile marketer I've ever met. I could never get him to pay for anything. But he did viral marketing like I've not, and he put a giant banner out there. So congratulations, you got someone who will be fiscally responsible.
I couldn't be happier.
So anyways,
Fantastic.
congrats to you guys and appreciate it, Tim.
Hey, thanks a lot.